Welcome to Facts on the Ground. I'm Jesse Zorwell, and I'm joined by my co-host, Misty Winston. And today we're speaking with UK-based journalist, Mohamed Elmaazi. Mohamed, thank you once again for joining us. And today we are going to go over briefly the case of Craig Murray. So for those who don't know who Craig Murray is, can you just give us a brief background on him, his case, and what he's facing at this point?
Yes, okay. So Craig Murray is a former British diplomat turned whistleblower during the Tony Blair years when he was ambassador to Uzbekistan. He blew the whistle on the fact that the Uzbek government was engaged in rather terrible practices of torture, which the British state were covering up. And then he ultimately transitioned into focusing on blogging and writing about human rights, and he's championed causes such as that of Julian Assange, who he came to know, and he reported extensively on Julian Assange's extradition case, etc. I used to see him a lot. I used to interview him as well when I was reporting on the months of the extradition proceedings, which of course haven't finished yet, right? That's in the process of being appealed by the US government, the decision by the judge not to extradite Julian Assange on health grounds. And Craig Murray, who's based in Scotland, who's Scottish, is also a supporter of Scottish independence from the UK to become a separate independent state, and was a long-time supporter, and I think still is a member of the Scottish National Party, and was supportive of Alex Salmond, the former First Minister of Scotland and former leader of the Scottish National Party, the SNP. The current leader, the current First Minister is Nicola Sturgeon. And that's relevant because Alex Salmond found himself, so he was getting more vocal and critical, along with others, of Nicola Sturgeon for not pressing harder for independence, right? Because the SNP's whole thing was independence, and they gained, loads of seats. They defeated the typically Labour sort of stronghold positions, and they gained control of the executive. So there's obviously a local parliament there and a local executive, that's the Scottish government, but they'll also have members of parliament who are in the UK parliament as well. And their main criticism was, there's a number of them, but the main criticism was that they're like kicking the independence issue into the long grass, right? That it's just like to make it a longer term issue, and that they seem to, at least for now, have given up on the issue. And that was a strong critique or criticism. Now, whichever line on that you end up about independence is sort of, or even their critique is sort of irrelevant. This was a well-known sort of publicly reported issue about sort of infighting within the SNP. Eventually, Alex Salmond finds himself being charged with, I think it's 14 counts of sexual harassment and sex assault and sexual harassment charges. And as this is coming out, that he's being investigated, is being detained or arrested, and that there will be an upcoming trial, evidence starts to leak that there might be something wrong with the process by which this investigation started in the first place, including emails and text messages of civil servants, senior ranking members of the SNP bureaucracy and civil service, sort of apparently coordinating or colluding with alleged victims, with each other and alleged victims, and what appeared more and more to be that there was a sort of, I suppose you could use the term conspiracy, others have used it, to destroy the reputation of Alex Salmond. And Craig Murray, who has this blog that a number of people read, where he also publishes his articles about Julian Assange and also other whistleblowers. He's been out there for other whistleblowers, including US whistleblowers, Edward Snowden, right, where he's been very supportive and critical of the process against them, was quite critical of this process and wrote a number of articles that were, this is before a jury has been impaneled, mind you, right? So the trial hasn't begun. and he's written a number of articles that one of them was actually a satirical piece in the theme of Yes Minister, which is an old British political satire during the 1980s, set within looking at a government minister and some civil servants, and the civil servants are constantly rolling the government minister who's a bit of an idiot and he's trying to get certain policies done, and then there's the backlash from the civil service bureaucracy. Right, it's basically pro-Thatcherite propaganda, because this was at a time when Thatcher was pushing for mass privatization and also purging of the unions, of the radical unions in the civil service. But it was a very popular show. I used to watch it when I was young as well, and it's funny. And so he crafted a story in which there is a conspiracy between a senior members of the Scottish government and some other people in order to destroy the reputation of a competitor, of a political opponent, right? After the trial, so this is before the trial, right? And so it should also be pointed out that eventually the judge passes an order prohibiting the publication of information that would likely lead to the identification of protected witnesses. Now, in this case, the protected witnesses are the alleged victims in Alex Salmond's trial. And Craig Murray does not publish their names or anything like that, but he does write articles both before the order, and I can't recall if there were a couple afterwards, which look at the sort of background circumstances and sort of describe certain aspects of who the accusers are, but without specifically, key identifying, not like where they live or what have you, or that they held the position of like national security advisor, and everyone would know there's only one of those, something like that, right? That I just made that up. There is one of the complainants is not the national security advisor.
Right.
Right? That was just an example of a job where you could pick a job where everyone would know who the person is. The trial happens. I would point out that because of these revelations that are coming out, these leaks of collaboration and apparent impropriety in the process by which the charges get brought against Alex Salmond, he ends up bringing what's known as judicial review, a judicial review of the process itself. This is before his trial begins, right? Judicial review, just so as not to confuse Americans, quite often in the United States, when you think of judicial review, it will be the process by which a judge will determine, for example, if legislation is constitutional or being applied constitutionally or what have you. But here in this country, well, England, Wales, and Scotland, judges can't strike down legislation. They don't do that. They're not able to do that. It's not part of the system. Judicial review is reviewing the legality of decisions or lack of decisions made by public bodies, local government, a government minister, a regulatory agency, the police, right? When you're going to a judge, and this is different than a lawsuit, which could take far longer than a JR, is when you go and you say that their actions were outside the boundaries of the law, or they acted in a way that they do not have the legal authority to do so, or that they behaved in a way that was so unreasonable as to be unlawful, right? And these are high thresholds, right, to convince a judge to intervene, because they see it as intervening in the political sphere. So you have to convince them that they've actually acted so unreasonably as to be unlawful, for example. And he sought a judicial review, and he obtained a judgment in his favor, and he got all of his costs back, which is quite rare. All of his legal costs, which is over £100,000, and it was all over the news, right? That or it might have been 200,000, I can't recall. That is one of the highest awards of legal costs. And part of the judgment said that the decision to launch this investigation was tainted by apparent bias, right? Among unlawful, unreasonable, and tainted by apparent bias. So that's a big deal. Then he goes to trial. and he's found not guilty on all counts. A little after that, the prosecutor, the chief prosecutor, if you like, procurator fiscal, but that's just the Scottish terminology, on behalf of the Attorney General's office, but on behalf of the executive, brings a petition, a contempt of court petition against Craig Murray. And they're basically saying that he did a number of things. Basically, he violated the court order, therefore by committing contempt of court. And the way he did this was a number of ways. One of them was that these articles that he published before the court order nonetheless violated the terms there, which, I mean, that got thrown out, right? There is another, oh yeah, no, the ones that he'd published before the jury had been impaneled was at risk of prejudicing the jury, because in this country, you can't do that. In the United States, there's the First Amendment, but in this country, once court proceedings have begun, even if it's just like and of course, there's a whole issue. When have court proceedings technically begun? Is it before? It could be before the jury's impaneled. It could be easily once the person's arrested. There's certain things that you're not allowed to publish, right? But the thing is, those were sitting online and they were aware of them, for one case for 11 months, the other for 7 months, and they waited till after the trial. So that seemed pretty outrageous. It's like, so you could have gone to the judge at the time and said, hey, can you instruct this person to take this article off of his blog? And one of them was the Yes Minister article that I'd raised. Another one was an article, I think it was published, there was a letter written to him by somebody else detailing lots of these issues, alleged conspiracy against Alex Salmond. And I think the court quite rightly rejected it, although I was surprised that, you know, for me, that seemed like a kitchen sink argument that seemed to weaken the legitimacy, in my mind at least, of the overall prosecution, because you're trying to say that this guy prejudiced a jury or was at risk, high risk of doing so with his articles, and yet you never sought a court to instruct him or raise the issue before the judge. You waited, you know, almost a year in one case after the trial as well. And he had no good reason. I followed the trial. I covered the trial, Craig Murray's trial. And so another one of the charges, the one that he was ultimately found guilty of, the only one of the 3 charges, was that one or more of his articles, in conjunction with other articles that he'd written or in conjunction with other information available to the public, could be assembled like a jigsaw puzzle in a way that could lead a member of the public to identify one or more of the complainants.
And this is actually referred to as the jigsaw identification.
Jigsaw identification.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this is a known thing outside of, you know, so this is one way, for example, intelligent, like spies or intelligence agencies, if they want to try to identify somebody, they might see various news articles and combined with their own information, you're piecing together a puzzle, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the thing is, while there is a bit of case law, it's not a heavily settled set of law, right? It's not like, oh, we have decades of case law or decades of cases of jigsaw identification. We don't actually. And I imagine this is something that's just become more of an issue because of the internet.
Yeah.
Right? That it's because of just the ease of access of information now compared to before, where you had to physically go and have a newspaper or a book or go to the library or what have you. It's not just, you can just go to a device with this information, just go around searching everywhere. The defense for their part argued that there are others who published so-called jigsaw identification to a greater degree who are in the mainstream press, and they gave examples of that any jigsaw identification they rejected that there was jigsaw identification, but they also said any would have been accidental, right? Not accidental because it's not like anyone was named, but that there was no intent to jigsaw identify anybody, that Craig Murray actually knew the identities of at least some of them, and if he wanted to, he could have identified them, but he didn't. And then another key issue came down to the legal test. The prosecution were arguing that the way the court should apply, and this is a 3-judge panel, and key to this is that the lead judge, the one who asked all the questions during the contempt of court trial, because there's no jury, it's a judge, it's just judges, and they're all senior judges, and the lead judge, Lady Dorian, she is the second most senior judge in Scotland, but she's also the judge that oversaw the trial of Alex Salmond. And you can understand why a judge who oversaw a trial might be involved in contempt of court proceedings, combined with 2 other judges, but you could also see why that might be an issue as well, right? Especially because the other 2 judges are going to be dependent on the viewpoints, or heavily influenced, you might expect, on the viewpoints of the judge who oversaw the trial. Bear in mind, the judge already knows the identities of the witnesses. So when you're reading articles and looking to see whether or not you think they lead to jigsaw identification, or the extent to which, whether it's a high likelihood, right? Because there's a likelihood issue as well, right? It's not just a mere possibility. You already know who these people are, so you're able to piece the puzzle in your mind in a way that you wouldn't necessarily, if you weren't aware of who they were, and you just became aware through the trial as in order to see, right? So that's where
And
there's
it seems very shaky too, because it's not just did what Craig write help identify. It's, were you able to use Craig's articles in conjunction with everything else out there? Which it's impossible as a writer or a journalist to be able to foresee what other information will be out for the public to obtain, and how that might work in conjunction with what you're writing. And so that seems like a very vague and very shaky basis for a prosecution of someone.
Well, certainly where the test isn't clear. So the prosecution argument was, okay, the test should be applied that even people with specific knowledge, right? If it's just people, so it's not a everyday member of the public, but if it's even, let's say it's somebody who's a friend of one of the accusers whose identity is protected, but she doesn't know that she's an accuser, but she knows her, and she knows her where she works and all this stuff. If she is able to piece together information because of her pre-existing knowledge, then that should be enough to find somebody guilty. The defense argued, no, it needs to be wider. It will be on a case-by-case basis. So if it's in a very small town and there's oh my God, I've forgotten the term where you have that tower which shines a light on a lighthouse.
Oh.
So, and there's only 2 people who work in the lighthouse, and you say that there's a woman who's allegedly raped who works in the lighthouse. Okay, that would be, very different, because everyone in that town knows that there's only 2 people who work in that lighthouse, right? And one of them was a woman. But that would be quite different from this scenario, they argued. It depends on the situation, but they said it shouldn't be down to whether someone has more specific knowledge. Ultimately, the court sided with the test pushed by the prosecution. And the very fact that this debate was had is reflective of the fact that the law is not settled as to what should the test be. So he's found guilty. He's given 9 months imprisonment, which in England and Wales, 8 months, forgive me, he's given 8 months imprisonment, which in England and Wales would typically mean that that's 4 months actual incarceration and then 4 months out. Although I spoke to Craig yesterday, that was on Thursday, and he notified me that somebody else who was done for identifying somebody, or somebody who got, they got 1 month more than 50%. And they believed it might have been, although they couldn't prove it, because they had refused to share a cell, because there you could choose whether or not you want to share a cell or you don't want to share a cell, assuming prisons here, some of them are over maximum capacity. It's horrendous. So in such a case, you don't get any choices. And he thought that was retaliation, which seemed interesting to me, because I wasn't aware that prison authorities would have, or the Ministry of Justice would have, a say in how long you spend in there, because in England and Wales it's different, but it's different legal systems, even though it's all part of the UK, right? They appealed on the basis that the prison sentence was disproportionate, especially given the fact that you couldn't say this was deliberate, although they did seem to imply that they believed he did desire to identify them. He did seek to go behind the order and violate the order indirectly through jigsaw identification.
Even though they ruled that his motive and intent were
irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
And also the argument that was made, not explicitly, but implicitly, of selective prosecution was also deemed irrelevant. It's irrelevant if other people in the mainstream press with a far larger audience are publishing more so-called jigsaw identification. You're the one who's being prosecuted. So that was deemed irrelevant. A poll which they had done, which showed that more than 80% of people who said that they thought they could identify the witnesses said that they'd done so through mainstream reporting, was made clear by the courts that they considered that irrelevant, and in fact, it was withdrawn as a submission by the defense, which in contempt of court cases is known as the respondent. But I'm just using defense just to make it easier, and petitioner rather than prosecutor. But that's just for ease of listeners, so they understand who I'm talking about. So there was a social services report about his health, the fact that he's got a newborn baby, that he's got a pulmonary condition, that he's in his 60s, that he's a respected former diplomat for many years, worked in the Foreign Office, public service, etc. But they came down, I think, first, the High Court, which is the same judges who found him guilty, refused to allow him to appeal to the Supreme Court. So then the next option is you go straight to the Supreme Court and ask them permission to appeal. And they can either grant permission, in which case you hear out the case, or they refuse permission. And we just heard that they'd refused permission on the basis that there were no arguable points in law or matters of public interest or concern. That's what we're told, but I haven't seen the actual written decision. It might be a one-line decision, or they might go into detail as to why they're refusing it. But I found it kind of rather surprising, especially just given, if not for the disproportionate sentence, and this is the first time somebody has been found imprisoned, I think it is, in 70 years in Scotland for media contempt, and 50 years in the UK more broadly. But for whatever reason, and also the test, like we said, one of the key grounds of appeal was that the test itself is too vague and lacked enough specificity, that people should in advance know what the test is, and therefore that should be reflected in the court order, that you shouldn't be in a situation where you can in good faith write something and then it's said that it's combined with other material in such a way that could lead to somebody being identified. But the Supreme Court refused to hear it. And it's, I'll just throw in a couple other things just for people to know background. Lady Dorian has also recently completed a review, the one who oversaw both Alex Salmond's sex assault trial, for which he was acquitted on all charges, but as well as oversaw the trial of Craig Murray for contempt. She also led a review which concluded that rape cases should not have a jury and should have specialized courts with specially trained judges. So there does seem to be, there have been those who've said there is like a degree of conflict of interest there, that A, she oversaw this case, B, that she seems to have a preference for abolishing juries, at least in rape cases, which I'm not quite sure how that would make things better, but there is a constant push to abolish jury trials here anyway. In fact,
yeah, and she's one of the leading proponents, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, well, at least in rape cases. But there was a push by the Scottish government a number of months back to suspend all jury trials and just have judge-held trials because of the lockdown and all the consequences of it. And the pushback was so great that they, at least for now, said like, oh, okay, fine. But there's like, oh, it's only going to be temporary. Well, people may not know that the British government, so that's the Scottish government, that's not the British government doing this, right? But the British government did suspend jury trials in the north of Ireland noting, oh, it's the violence and sectarian conflict and the difficulty of having jury trials, but they'll just be temporary. Well, the Good Friday Agreement was signed when? In 98?
Mhm.
We're now 2021. Where are jury trials in the north of Ireland? They're still not there. They've never returned. So there's certain things that once they're gone, it's almost impossible to get back, or it'll be like almost revolutionary to get them back. And in fact, at least 50% of all jury trials here in England and Wales were abolished years ago. You're no longer entitled to a jury in civil cases. So if you sue a company, for polluting or for damaging you, or personal injury or things like that, it's a judge that hears the case. It's no longer a jury. That's in England and Wales. So it's so there does seem to be an alignment, and Craig Murray himself in the statements did say he believed this was a potential retaliation for his whistleblowing activities, for which that he was heavily, attacked for years ago. I think certainly his writing that was heavily critical of the prosecution of Alex Salmond at a time when most of the writing in the mainstream press, of which there's very little mainstream press there, so only a few outlets overall, was not particularly critical of the prosecution of Alex Salmond. I don't think that helped him.
Yeah. I think it's
can't-
also fair to
I-
speculate that his relationship with WikiLeaks and with Julian Assange and his coverage of that case may have also played a small role. Obviously, that's just speculation, but I think that that's a fair thing to wonder about.
Well, being this type of person, I would say certainly enhances your likelihood of being caught in the crosshairs. Because if
Mhm.
this was such an important issue, this jigsaw identification, then why aren't you bringing charges against people in mainstream press who, if it's about sending a message, right, then that's surely much more significant because all the other press will be covering it. It's a major outlet. It will, but I think it is sending a message, but it is somewhat chilling because I'm still not clear then. So what if I write something that could conceivably be combined with somebody who knows extensive detail about a case?
Yeah,
I
that
could be,
seems very vague and very selectively applied.
Yeah,
Which is
and I think that's
terrifying.
pretty obviously an attempt to muzzle. And
Yes.
what I find ironic about Craig's case is that, as you said, Mo, there's no precedent for this, but in charging him, in sentencing him, they are setting a precedent, which
Yes.
is very dangerous.
Yeah, which is why I'm surprised that the Supreme Court refused to hear it. But like I said, we'll have to see the details. And the prison will be relatively close to Craig's family, which is good.
Yeah.
The one that it looks like he'll be going to, although apparently he can't bring books with him or even be sent books. He could be sent money though. People could send money, cash money apparently, but I would send it special delivery. You have to check to see, different prisons have different rules. Or even a pen and paper, or pencil and paper, apparently hard to come by. He's not quite sure what the situation is with the library. I understand from, there's an activist, one of the activists that we both know, has said that he apparently will have to surrender himself by Sunday, but I hadn't seen that. I know you heard that, Misty.
Yes, Allie, my dear friend Allie, who's one of the amazing Assange activists who, does Craig Murray's, they just like to be out in the streets. But she tweeted about it earlier that he has until 11 a.m. Sunday. That's not confirmed. I don't have like official confirmation on that.
Yeah.
But she's a pretty reliable source. So I'd say that it's better than good chance that she's accurate there. But yeah, so he has until 11 a.m. Sunday to surrender himself.
Yeah, and we thought it was going to be today. They did say that they'll see about trying to appeal it to the European Court of Human Rights, but bear in mind, by that point in time, he'll have served his sentence.
Yeah.
So,
That's
and
a
in
long
fact, he was
process.
supposed to have served it previously, but they got the court to delay issuing the warrant for his arrest on the basis that, is it for his arrest or for him to be taken into custody? On the basis that the Supreme Court was hearing the appeal, and they had signaled that by the end of July that they would have a decision one way or the other as to whether they'd grant permission. So the High Court, I think, agreed to delay that, which I suppose is good. So you not end up serving the sentence, which is, by the way, that's commonly what would happen, is that you would be incarcerated while your appeals are under are ongoing, with exceptions, obviously, and his was one exception. So we'll see from here. I think people can find out how to write letters if they want to write letters of support. That's one thing that I suppose if accessing a books are difficult, people can still have, that's still something you
Yeah,
get to
once
read.
we know for sure where he'll be, I'll get something going on Twitter, a writer letting campaign of some kind, much as we do for Julian, and we're doing for Daniel Hale now. Once we figure out where he's headed to as well. So yeah, it's just kind of interesting to me today. I don't know if you know, Mo, but today in the United States, it's National Whistleblower Day, National Whistleblower
Yeah.
Appreciation Day, and this week we've seen Daniel Hale sentenced, and now we have Craig Murray heading to jail. So it's kind of a farce. But here we are. So I appreciate you. I know you have to go. You have a meeting to get to, but I appreciate you coming on to give us an update on this. It's something that I wish more people were paying attention to. I don't know how prevalent it is in the UK, but in the United States, people aren't really talking about it much at all or covering it. So we appreciate you coming on to let us know what's going on, the update, and where we're headed from here. Hopefully he only has to do the 4 months. It's a shame that he has to do any time at all. So once we get a better idea of where he'll be headed, we'll get a letter writing campaign up and running. So thanks for coming on and talking to us about it. We appreciate you and all the work that you do. Everybody
Thanks, Mo.
should follow Mo's work. Do you want to tell everybody where they can find the stuff that you're doing now?
Right. So I'm on Twitter at Elmaazi, ELMAAZI. And I publish currently with Electronic Intifada, The Dissenter, and The Canary. I should have a few pieces coming out soon on various issues.
Yeah, you published a really good piece in May at the Dissenter, so we'll link to that. It kind of breaks down everything that's
Craig Murray's case, and there should be another one coming up soon about Assange. So
cool. So everybody
Excellent.
check out Mo's work. He does great work. Everybody should support independent journalists as much as you can. Even just sharing their work is very helpful. So thanks for joining us. We appreciate you, and we will catch everybody next time.